Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Wyandot County Museum. Thank you for coming out on this dark, dreary night, which is actually kind of similar to what we're going to be learning about later. So Mother Nature decided to kind of give us a similar evening. So this is our next to last Thursday evening presentation. We have one more on November 9th. Micah Harris, one of our board members, will be talking about pre- and post-war Imperial Japan, and that will kind of tie into the start of our Veterans Day program, which will have November 10th through the 13th. That'll be 1 to 5 each day. There's no admission, but donations are always accepted, and for the Veterans Day, all of the donations we receive are put into a special pot that allows us to buy archival materials to store our growing military collection, uniforms, documents, other things like that. And speaking of the Veterans Day, we have our annual raffle in which we'll be pulling the winning tickets on November 11th during Veterans Day at about 4 o'clock. We do have a few tickets here. They're only $20 each if you'd want to purchase one or two before you leave this evening. We've got... Not yet. So the winning ticket will receive their choice of a Colt Python 357 Magnum or a $1,000 Walmart gift card. And then the second ticket drawn will get whatever prize was not chosen. So we'll pull about 3 or 4 tickets just to make sure that we have enough people to have the winning tickets be picked up. Okay. All right. Lonnie says to remind you they need to pass a background check and be eligible and meet all requirements for the state of Ohio and the federal government to actually purchase the handgun. I'll hand the microphone over to you since you want to keep talking.
Is it my turn now?
We'll make it your turn.
Okay. So, he gets to talk about guns and I get to talk about a fashion show. So anyway, a fashionable night at the museum is coming up on Friday night, December 15th from 5 to 7 right here. And it's not a fashion show in the traditional sense. We're not going to have chairs set up and the models come in and swing around. But we'll have the models mingling with our crowd at the mocktail party. We're not allowed to serve alcohol here, so we will have drinks that look like cocktails, and we will have fashions from the arts department store upstairs being modeled. We'll have dresses and coats from our textile collection, and then also from Papillon Boutique in Findlay, Southern Accents in Marion, and Threads in Tiffin, and then Color Me Unique here in Upper Sandusky and Creekside. See, you had to help me. Creekside here in Upper. And we're going to have local women doing this, mingling with the crowd, so it should be lots of fun. And you can come and go. This is not something you have to be here from 5 to 7. You can come in at 6 and leave at 6:30. And we're asking for a $10 donation. We have some tickets if you want to purchase ahead of time, but you don't have to. You can buy them at the door, because this will be a flowing crowd. It's not as though, wouldn't it be wonderful if like 200 people showed up, but they wouldn't all be here at the same time, so it'd be a flowing thing. So hope to see you then, and of course the museum will already be decorated for Christmas, so it should be lots of fun. Okay, so now it is my pleasure to introduce Ron. Actually, I'm going to leave him alone and let him do his own program about the Celery King, even though I would like to help.
You can stay up here.
No.
Anybody that was here last week know this is kind of a joke because Bonnie left me alone, so as the curator, I had to introduce myself as the director to speak.
I forgot to introduce him last week.
Yeah. So, again, I want to welcome you to the program tonight, which I'll be talking about the murder of William Clarence Johnson, also known as the Celery King. Now, I know a lot of you, when you came in, said, I have no idea what you're going to be talking about tonight. So, how many people out there have actually heard of the Celery King before? So, just a few. Okay. So that's good. A lot of people, when I mention the Celery King, they have really no idea what I'm talking about. I really didn't know much about this when I first started here in 2011. There was a case that at the time it was upstairs that had all kinds of murders of Wyandot County, but it had just very basic information about them. So I started researching all of them, and when I brought the display downstairs, I decided to add a little more. And over the years, I've given presentations on historic murders of Wyandot County, which just briefly went over a lot of these. Bonnie, again, wanted me to do something in-depth for Halloween, kind of a spooky, and she's like, how about going more in detail of one of your murder cases? So that's how the idea of the Celery King came about. So this is William Johnson. Unfortunately, there's not very many good photographs of him because when he was murdered, it was September 11th, 1900. So a lot of the images are just grainy pictures from newspapers of the time. So William Johnson was born November 16th, 1856 in South Newbury in Geauga County, Ohio. And he was raised, his parents had a farm in Lorain County. And so he decided after a while that he wanted his own farm. So to the derision of most people, he came to Wyandot County and bought about 10 acres of swampland in the northern part of Wyandot County to start a farm. The first few years were not very good. He said he built a small greenhouse on his own and started raising celery, onions, beets, cabbage, and other, quote, garden truck vegetables. So he would raise enough to basically sell the crop to make money. He eventually went bankrupt in his first attempt after a couple years. His father gave him money, and so he bought more acres and started a new farm. Eventually he was successful. Everybody kept making fun of him because he had been a failed swamp farmer in the early years. But once he started making money, he began operating what was known as the Wild Rose Celery Farm near Cary. And at its height, they said he employed over 50 farm hands. And he would grow crops to the point where he would take multiple wagons in during the season, and he would even grow enough to fill up railroad cars. And this was at the point when he kept doing this, that he was so successful and that he came to the attention of some local criminals. And as we go along, I'll tell more of that story. So he married Ada Miranda Pickering. She was born June 17, 1862 in Antrim Township in Crawford County. They were married November 24th, 1880, and then they would go on to have 5 children. As you can see from her headstone, she lived until December of 1933, so over 30 years after her husband was killed, she still lived. And it was through a lot of her speaking on behalf of her husband, her witness statements, that the men were eventually convicted. although the way she identified them was maybe not necessarily what we would think is appropriate today. And so this, as we get into it, you'll find there's a lot of controversy, a little bit of conspiracy, a lot of court intrigue over these cases. So the couple had 5 children. The oldest was Albro Pickering, who was born in 1882, and that's him there. And that's with his younger brother, Tracy Valentine Pickering, who was born in 1884. They had another brother named Ross, born in 1892. And then they had 2 sisters, Ada, born in 1887, and May, born in 1895. And from what I can find, neither of the sisters ever married. It appears that all 3 of the boys did marry and raise families, but for whatever reason, the 2 daughters, lived as up until old age. There's never any indication that they had a family or anything. They just lived with their mother until she passed, and then they apparently lived together. So this was what I found in the 1879 Atlas of Wyandot County. In the northern part of Crawford County, you see there's a section here, William Johnson, and the little house indicated right there. They said that he built a greenhouse and he attached a 2-story house to the original greenhouse. And this was right along the railroad tracks, which will come in very prominent as we get into the details of the case. So if anybody has any comments or has any questions as we go along, I'll be happy to try to answer them, or I can answer most of them at the end. So to give you an idea of what it looked like, I found a picture from the 1890s of what a celery farm looked like. So this would have been in the marshlands north of Cary, just rows and rows of the carrots, beets, onions, and so he was very prominent for primarily celery. He was really good at raising celery in that area, but he also did a bunch of other small root vegetables. And so we get on to the story, the reason you're here, and I actually have an assistant to help me begin the story. So, Snoopy, it was a dark and stormy night, like tonight. Suddenly a shot rang out. Yeah, the plot is thickening. So I'll take over from now, Snoopy. So according to the newspaper, the night of September 11th, 1900 was the stormiest of the year. A fearful gale accompanied by rain and thunder and lightning all night, reaching a climax about 4 a.m. Telephone and telegraph lines were down all over the county, making it difficult to get in contact with the authorities once this happened. According to this, Farmer Johnson rose hastily and started to get his revolver. They had heard people coming into the house, and so his wife roused him up and said, there's noise different from the storm outside. And then they heard voices. So according to one newspaper article, he got up, went across the hallway into their oldest daughter's bedroom where they kept the revolver. And it was after he picked the gun up and was heading back to his bedroom that he came across in the view of the intruders, and he was shot. As he passed the doorway, a shot was fired. Farmer Johnson fell with a bullet in the abdomen. He had received a single shot that ruptured one of the stomach arteries, and he immediately started to bleed out. His wife, Ada, screamed, of course, at the shot, and she said, let me attend to him. And the robbers decided, no, you're not going to do it. So they then took her, bound her, and gagged her along with the oldest boys and the oldest daughter. According to her, they were all wearing masks, so they really didn't know who they were, but they were dressed really rough. And so they referred to them as a group of 5 tramps that had broken into the house. She knew that there were apparently 5 men because she could see the 3 that were upstairs rifling through the house looking for items. And she could hear voices of 2 others downstairs. They went through, and the reason that this group, though, was sometimes known as the Finley gang or the Foster gang, who was accused of doing this, but whoever was there knew that just earlier in that day that William Johnson had taken a train car load of onions to Finley to sell. And there was a story that William Johnson really did not like banks. He didn't trust banks. And so for years he would sell the wagon load of vegetables and take the money back to the house. And it was only after prodding that his wife would get him to take it to the bank. After years of hearing her harping that take the money to the bank, he had actually deposited the $1,000 or so from that carload into the Cary Bank that day. And he had gotten back after a long day to work from going up to Finley and to Cary and back home about 10 o'clock and went to sleep with the rest of the family. The robbers came in about 11:30 when this all happened. So, according to the newspaper articles from September 12th, William Johnson was shot and instantly killed at his home. There were 5 men that were arrested north of Rising Sun. And a lot of this, after they had tied up Mrs. Johnson and the kids, they went searching through the house and they said, "Where is the money?" And she said, they constantly said, "We know he sold the crops this morning. Where is the money?" And she said, "There is no money in the house." So they searched. The only thing that they could find was about $10 in the kids' savings, and they took the Algro watch, the silver watch of the oldest son, and the revolver. That was the only thing that they made off with. As they searched through the house, they said because it was dark and stormy, they had carried 2 lanterns. One was from the Hocking Valley Railroad, and we actually have the lantern in the display case in the other room that was reportedly used by the robbers who had left it behind. So they left, and eventually the oldest boy was managed to untie himself, hollered out to his mother that, "I'm free, I'm going to untie you." He then untied his younger brother, and the 2 oldest boys took off by horseback into Cary to try to raise the awareness of the police of what happened. So they got a hold of Deputy Sheriff Ira Pontius, and they went on the trail hunting for the masked criminals that did this. And they eventually arrested 5 men near the town of Rising Sun. So the original men that were arrested is Thomas B. Gillespie, who was 43, a laborer out of Cleveland, originally from Rhode Island. Frank Lewis, who was 22, a brass worker from Dayton. William Day, 38, a laborer from Southern Ohio. Edward Welsh, 52, a laborer from Pittsburgh. And Frank Conway, 29, a table waiter from New York City. A lot of the people in Cary reported seeing these 5 gentlemen together in town the day before. And one of the ways that they were arrested was they brought in 3 bloodhounds from the Mansfield Reformatory. They let them sniff some of the articles that were left behind by the robbers. And they followed the trail up to around the town of Alveda. And that's where kind of the story picks up of how they arrived from Finley and Alveda. The men that were originally accused said they had just rode the train in and were staying in Cary for a couple of days, and then they were headed out of town. The bloodhounds reportedly followed their trail up to Alveda, and then when they got off the train, then they went to a camp where these men were, and the bloodhounds reportedly sniffed again and said, this is where the men are. Although they said when they took the bloodhounds back the next day to the prison to positively identify, the bloodhounds had no reaction to the men. Eventually, these 5 men were released. And 5 other men, which we'll talk about tonight, Charles Foster, Locke Foster, George Urey, Marsh Lindsay, and Willis Miller, were accused and indicted. One of the ways that the men arrived to the house was, according to the first court trial, the 5 men had rented a carriage in Findlay, a 2-horse Surrey, and lots of residents noticed these men riding this wagon up north towards Fostoria and into Alveda. The little railroad house in Alveda was broken into, and a hand car was stolen. The hand car was wheeled down to just outside of the Johnson home, which we saw earlier was beside the railroad track. The men made their getaway on the hand car back up to Fostoria. And there's a lot of conflicting stories. The men said they had alibis, that they, like George Urey said, everybody in my tenant house saw me there that night. Although under questioning, that story began to fall apart. They said, well, we weren't the ones that ordered the Surrey. There was a group of 5 children, 5 teenagers went for a joyride in Findlay, and they're the ones that rented the Surrey. Well, they said, on the stormiest night of the year, it didn't really seem like a good night to go out to the pumpkin patch and for a ride. So there are lots of stories, but the most interesting way is how these men came to the notice of the Wyandot County Sheriff. These men were known collectively as the Foster Gang or the Findlay Gang. They were part of a larger group of safecrackers, home robbers, horse thieves. Ben Landis was in the Ottawa jail awaiting trial. He called Sheriff Cliff from Wyandot County and said, I know who broke into the house. He said, I'll give you their names. And so, based upon his testimony, these 5 men were identified that they were apparently part of the gang and he did not get along with. So he told Sheriff Cliff everything about them. And Ben Landis was eventually released on his own recognizance, and he spent the next week at the Wyandot County Sheriff's Office laying out the plan and how this happened. So this is a photograph of Sheriff Cliff, and this 4 of the 5 men that were accused: George Urey, Charles Foster, Willis Miller, and Locke Foster, and then Benjamin Meck, who was the prosecuting attorney. So Sheriff Cliff sat and listened to Ben Landis lay out the story based on things that he had heard, people that he knew in the Ohio penitentiary that knew these men, and in exchange for a reduced sentence, Ben Landis' testimony was taken, but he was never required to speak in the court about what he saw or heard. At the time in 1900, it was technically illegal to promise a prisoner a lesser sentence in exchange for testimony. So this was one part where there gets to be a little controversy about how these men were identified. They were rivals of Landis, and that's how they ended up on the appearance of the sheriff. So the men were accused in March of 1901 of being a part of the murder ring. There were actually several of them were on trial as being part of a horse trading ring, and when they were about to be acquitted, that's when Sheriff Cliff walked in and said, "Hey, you're under arrest for the murder. So they said George Uri was sitting there with his wife, and he was just gently tapped on the shoulder and arrested, and a couple of the others were. And one of the comments was, it's a darn shame that you can't be an honest horse thief without being accused of something else. So they said, the Foster gang said they didn't do it, so there was a lot of articles talking about the so-called the ring of tramps that were arresting houses. What I found in an interesting newspaper from Bucyrus, April 2nd, dateline for Upper Sandusky lists the men that were arraigned in front of Judge Boston Young for the murder. The same date in Kenton, 5 tramps forced their way into a home of Theodore Miller. Mrs. Miller scared the men away with a revolver. So there's about 3 or 4 other articles about a group of 5 shabby-looking men in masks breaking into homes. But because Ben Landis gave all this testimony to Sheriff Cliff, the Foster gang, wanting to get them off the streets, they were the ones that were then accused of the murder. So, and this is where it starts to get interesting. This is a picture of Boston Young, who was the circuit court judge in the case, the criminal police judge. And he did something that had been unheard of in the United States at that time, or very rarely had anybody done it. He knew there were 5 men that were accused of murder. In order to give all 5 men a fair trial and have an untainted jury pool, he produced a restraining order, or one of the first gag orders in the United States. And the court has moved to make an order restraining any person from sending out for publication any of the evidence given in the trial of Charles Foster, or anything purporting to be evidence given in this case, or in the trial of said case. This was the first time that a judge had ever said that the newspapers were banned from publishing. One of the reasons he did this was, he said, he pleaded under the case that they needed to have an untainted jury pool. It actually was a matter of numbers, because they said if they had to have a change of venue, Wyandot County would have to pay for that change of venue. And so in order to save the county money, they said he came up with a scheme to keep the newspaper out. Well, this was met with a lot of anger from, as you can imagine, all the publications, the newspapers from around the state and the country, because they saw this sensational series of trials was going to sell papers. And so to not be able to publish, and so the Scripps McRae League, who represented newspapers in the foreign markets, as they listed at the time, the local markets of Upper Sandusky, Cary, they listened to the judge's order and obeyed it. So it was really difficult to find information there. But the foreign newspapers like Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, Marion, Bucyrus, all those far-flung destinations all started to publish what had happened. He was not happy, but there were a lot of editors' notes, what we would think today is like letters to the editor, things from the publishers just about how horrible this is. And so most of the foreign papers said, we're going to print it anyway, we don't care. If you have to change the venue, it doesn't matter to us. So the Scripps McRae League, which was one of the forerunners of the Associated Press and the United Press, they actually sued, seeking to remove this restraining order. And this went all the way up to the Ohio Supreme Court. And the court agreed that the judge has the right to do whatever he wants. If he wants to restrict publication of the case to ensure a, quote, free trial for the other defendants, he has the right to. So this was one of the first times that a gag order had ever been used in the United States, and it was right here in Upper Sandusky at the Wyandot County Courthouse. And we can see that, you know, all kinds of publication from the Tiffin paper. Publication of testimony in the murder trial is forbidden. Well, of course, they ignored it too, because once they realized that people really wanted to know about the case and the murder, because nobody knew what happened. They just knew this group of men went in and shot the Celery King. And, you know, he was well known throughout the area, Tiffin, Findlay, Cary, Upper Sandusky. So all these places wanted to know. And the Scripps McRae League sued because, to paraphrase, Judge Young believes the expulsion order will deprive his client to a speedy and public trial. And that was what the Scripps McRae said, that, you know, the record of such expulsion, you know, will be on the court records, but not in the publication of the newspapers. And they sued this, and it went to through the courts, and it was eventually all the higher courts basically upheld what Judge Young wanted to do. So, again, you'll see all kinds of articles about that. So we get into, you know, one of the first trials. The first one to go up was the trial of Charles Foster, who was known as the leader of the gang. So this Charles Foster, he was accused and went to trial in 1901, and there had been nothing published about this, and so they had two men that really were the main accusers of them. Ben Lannis, as I mentioned, and also Ben Wade. And Wade will testify that, you know, Foster said that he expected to go to the chair if he was convicted of this. He also said that they watched him and George Urey going through some old atlases trying to figure out a place that they could say that they were at the night of. So it was all circumstantial. It came up to Mrs. Johnson, who was testimony that I could recognize that these men who tied me up and blindfolded me, who they were. And so they said, well, how did you know? And she goes, well, I was close enough to them. I had to know who they were. The oldest son, Albro, also testified that he could recognize the men based on what they were wearing. So what did they do? They brought the men in, and the same with the youngest daughter, who said she could identify them by their mask and their clothing. They had them come in and change clothes multiple times until the children were able to identify them in the masks that they were wearing. So that's, you know, where it starts getting confusing. It's like all the information is based on an inmate heading to the Ohio penitentiary that figured a way out, and so he fingered them. So in the trial, they had the men wear masks and different outfits until the children were able to positively identify them. So the case went to trial, and all of this came to be. Even despite all this little controversy, Charles Foster, who was here, he was about 68 at the time. He was actually found guilty of first-degree murder. George Urey was the accused gunman, but they said Charles Foster was the criminal mastermind who came up with it. And the reason they knew was because up to a year before, apparently Foster and Urey had approached Ben Wade about being a part of the, quote, gardener job. We're going to go kill and rob a gardener up in Wyandot County. And so through all this, he was eventually accused. He was given a life sentence and was sent to the Ohio penitentiary. And so he tried to appeal the case, which, you know, was turned down. So after about 5 years in prison, the notice came that Charles Foster had died in prison. Up to the day he died, he said vehemently, I may be a bank robber, I may be a safe cracker, I may be a horse thief, but I am not a murderer. You have the wrong guy. So he was eventually brought back home, and then he was buried up in Maple Grove Cemetery in Findlay. Right now, as far as I can tell, he has an unmarked grave up there. But it is in with some of the Foster family members up in that area. The next man to go up in front of the judge was George Urey, and he brought in over 50 people that testified that he was up in the Fostoria area the week of the murder. Again, he claimed that, he was innocent of this. He could not be, the shooter because he wasn't there. Again, they had the children come through to identify them, wearing multiple disguises until they figured out that was the right person. So a lot of the eyewitness accounts was really kind of made up. They worked the rules until Ada, the wife, could identify them and the children could identify them. And he went up in front. He was convicted of first-degree murder, just like Charles Foster was. He was given a life sentence and sent to jail. Now, one of the reasons why Boston Young said he was worried about, having a change of venue, and it comes up in this article, what it cost the county. So to try George Urey, it cost Wyandot County $3,442.11, over $1,500 more than Charles Foster. And they could just see exponentially the cost rising. And so Wyandot County did not want to pay all these extra fees. So that was one of the reasons why they wanted to reduce the jury pool and have just a limited number of people to be involved in this case. So George went to prison all the time, saying that he wasn't responsible, that he had plenty of alibis, he had plenty of witnesses, putting him at all different places, even a couple of them that put him in a safe cracking job, and he was willing to admit to robbing a house to get out of prison for murder. So 1912, he had a lot of work on his behalf, primarily led by his wife, that kept fighting for the 10 years or so he was in prison. He went before Judge Harmon. The parole board even said, there is a really good chance that he did not do this case. We recommend parole. Governor Hammond, not wanting to be seen as soft on crime, said, well, he may or he may not have, but I know he's a bad guy, so I'm not going to approve his parole. So he went back to jail. Eventually, through additional work, in 1913, Governor James Cox actually approved his parole. He was convinced that through all of the alibis, the witnesses, all the circumstantial parts of the case, they said when Governor Cox started reading about, the positive identification after their daughter Ada had seen him in at least 15 different outfits, he was convinced that, it probably wasn't right. So George Urey was pardoned, and he's lived until 6 years later. He died in 1919 in Toledo. And then George Urey is actually buried in Riverside Cemetery in Defiance. Under his little headstone, it just says George Urey with his birth and death dates. There's nothing in there to indicate that he had been sent to prison or that he was a bank robber. even if you go on to find the degree, bless you, there is nothing in there that talks about his past history. So, then we go to the third case, which was Locke Foster. And Locke was the nephew of Charles Foster. He was also reportedly a great nephew of Governor Foster. So that was, again, another unique piece to this case, was the connection between the Foster gang and the former governor. So, in June of 1901, Locke Foster went to prison, in front of the court case. Here they misspelled his name as Ambrose, but Albro Johnson and Tracy Johnson positively identified him based on just the way they manhandled them in doing an attempted tie-up during the court proceedings. So it's, the more I read this, there were some really unique shenanigans going on in some of these court trials and some of these actions behind the scenes. Sheriff Cliff was positive that these men had done it because he got firsthand notice from a convicted horse thief. So, Locke Foster was, basically known as a foot soldier in there. He went along with the rest of them. He was never a real gunman of the group. After about 5 days, the trial ended up, and said that they wanted to strengthen the defendant's alibi, say it was impossible for Mrs. Johnson to positively identify him. So they brought in a masked subject in the middle of the courtroom for her to identify. And probably one of the dumbest statements I've read, Locke Foster reportedly said, "She couldn't identify us. We were wearing masks that night." I'm reading this and I'm thinking, really? Okay. That's a great way to prove that you're innocent, by making a dumb statement like that. So, he was also convicted of first-degree murder, but the jury recommended mercy, and he be given life imprisonment. And so, instead of having a potential death penalty, they just wanted to sentence him to life. But I find it, interesting that they recommended mercy for him. So again, after several years of trying to get a pardon, in 1914, another attempt was being made to liberate Locke Foster. It went through an affidavit sworn by Carl Wick of Findlay, who says that, he saw him in Findlay the night of the murder. There were a lot of witnesses that identified that they knew these people that were either in Findlay or Fostoria the night of September 11th, but those were usually discredited by the prosecuting attorney at the time. So, after spending about 12 years in prison, Locke Foster was eventually paroled, and he moved to Michigan after getting paroled. He wanted to get as far away from this state as possible, so he went all the way to southern Michigan. So he lived up until 1933. He was one of the youngest men in the gang, and so he was paroled, and like I said, went up to Michigan. When he died, I found him, he was listed as Lockwood Foster. So he was one of the hardest ones to kind of track down, because he was listed in some records as Locke Foster, L-O-C-K or L-O-C-K-E, and then eventually his death notice has him as Lockwood Foster, which I've never heard anybody named Lockwood before. But when he died, he's buried in the Brookmere Cemetery up outside of Cleveland. And they said originally this gang worked in the Cleveland area, but when it got too hot and the police were on their trail, they went to the lower crime area of Northwest Ohio, where they found a lot of easier marks. And one of the ways that they figured out how the houses were to break into, George Erie and Locke Foster came up with the idea that they would be photograph enlargers. People would have paintings done in their house, and so somebody would go in and photograph the painting, and then they wanted to have it blown up into a larger image. These men would figure out a way to get people to agree to let them go into the house and to look at the big artworks that needed to be reproduced as photographs. And they said that's how they knew a lot of these homes, and they were primarily safe crackers, so they would figure out where the safe might be. While one is talking to the homeowner, the other one is randomly scrounging around the house. So it's, again, he always said that, you know, I'm a safe cracker. I'm not a killer. I'm not a robber. He's like, I had nothing to do with this. So we get to the next case, which was Marshall Lindsay. I've never been able to find a photograph of him for this. I don't know why, when the group of 4 that was published in a Cincinnati paper in 1901 did not include Marshall Lindsay's photograph, but those were photographs that were taken were actually in the Ohio Penitentiary with their inmate numbers on them. So Lindsay was one who went to trial, again through the same kind of shenanigans. He was accused and he was convicted, but he was convicted of second-degree murder, and he said, you know, I can't believe it. If I'm guilty, I'm as guilty as all the rest. He goes, I want to be guilty of first-degree murder if I'm guilty, not second. Because he felt like that he was not as important as the rest of them. So he eventually convinced the judge to get a new trial. And he said, I never even knew or heard of the Celery King or the Celery Queen either. So he eventually got him a second trial, and between the first trial and the second trial in 1903, he took off for parts unknown. He managed to get them to give him a new trial, and then as soon as he got out, he jumped bail, leaving his sister with a $3,000 bail bond in 1903, which was quite a bit of money. And so he was pretty much given another life sentence in absentia for his court case. And then while he was here pending the motion for a new trial, he was suffering from consumption, and he went back and he turned himself in. He surrendered because he found out he was dying of tuberculosis. So he said he turned himself in, that way it would save his sister over $2,000 from fleeing the bail bond. And so he was sentenced to the penitentiary, and then he died July 17th in 1906. So about 2 years after he fled the court case, he then came back and turned himself in. About 6 months later, he died of tuberculosis, and this is his death notice. So it says here, Columbus, the city of Columbus, the hospital OP, which was the Ohio Penitentiary. So Marshall Lindsay died of tuberculosis, 1906, and so he was the second. So right now we have 2 men that died in prison and 2 men that were eventually paroled. And then we get to probably the most unique court case ever. Willis Miller, who was reportedly Willis Cady, going by an alias from Akron. He said that he was Willis Miller, that was his name, Willis Cady. He'd never heard of this person. Well, in the first of 3 fist fights during his court case, when he was beat up by one of the guards, he filed an affidavit against him. In the excitement, the prisoner, who insisted his name was Miller, signed it Willis Cady. Cady was a well-known criminal from the Akron area, and they said he was so rough that they kept him handcuffed throughout the entire case. So during the trial, this is one of the other ones, said Miller was mad. He took offense to Charles Dickens, who they brought up from the Ohio Penitentiary in the trial as a witness against him. So during the middle of it, he managed to get a hold of the cuspidor, the spittoon, threw it at the witness, jumped up and started to punch the witness, and said the defendant's brother and sister joined in the fray, attacking the witness and the prosecuting attorney. But that wasn't the worst of it. Then there was another one, Guard Grundage, the county jail. This was one that there was a fight, another fight where his lawyer actually got in fault with the bailiff. And there was one where the general fight ensued. The courtroom was in bedlam. So a lot of the women fainted and others screamed in terror, and they tried to scramble to get out of the room. So there were just multiple fist fights in his court case. And this is where it even gets even stranger. During Miller's court case, there were reportedly, quote, love letters written between Mrs. Johnson and Ben Landis, who was the man who accused all five of killing her husband. She said that she had written letters to him trying to get Landis to admit to who actually killed the five men and not the five that he accused. Well, they wanted to present these so-called love letters into the final case, Miller's case. The judge ruled them inadmissible. I would love to see what was in these letters. But Miller was like, yeah, it's all been a great conspiracy between the wife and Landis to get us out of the way. His thought was she wanted the money and the property, the farm. And Landis was the way to get rid of Johnson by having just somebody random kill her husband, and Landis accused other men. So he was found guilty of second degree as an accomplice during his first trial. Not happy with that. So he demanded a new trial, and the second time he was found guilty of first degree murder and sentenced to prison. He was not as lucky as some of the others. In January of 1907, he died of a septic abscess in the prison hospital. So we had three men that we think probably never committed the crime, died in prison after being sent there for murder, for being sentenced to first degree murder. Two men that were paroled for this. The five men that were originally accused of it disappeared with no idea. And there were other robberies that were broken in that you find that five tramps attacked people. So it's really unclear who actually killed the Celery King and if the right people ever were accused. And then Judge Wolf over in Marion, he decided to follow the course of Judge Young in forbidding the publication of news from a trial that he was overseeing. So Judge Young's first restraining order, a gag order, was quickly picked up by other judges, and it is still followed through today. And there was even an accused former president who was given a gag order recently and promptly disregarded it. But it was something, it was one of the first ones in the nation that was here in Wyandot County, and it's still the publication orders are still in use today. So that's more or less the story of the Celery King, and a lot of the twists and turns and really confusing and unique pieces to go along with it. So, well, thank you. If you have any questions,
Did the wife continue on with the farm? Did she continue running the farm, or who ran the farm, or is it still going? Or
I didn't really look into that part of it. I was looking into the criminal part, what happened to the men that were accused.
We live on the farm.
Okay.
Tracy took over the farm, and then we bought it from Tracy.
Okay, well, thank you.
And we have pictures. Tracy's grandkids come up every once in a while.
Do you still grow celery?
No.
Good heavens.
Thank you. This is great. This is some
how
images.
did they sell the celery? You know, they took in truckloads of it, but they didn't have any big grocery stores. How did they sell the small stores, or did they have a farmer's market, or?
A lot of these carloads would be sent to bigger cities and distributed throughout the cities and to producers of different vegetables and other things. So I know during the 1930s, the marshes over in Hardin County were really big on onions and beets and other root vegetables. So the marsh had, was really great soil to grow. And you find lots and lots of stories about these big carloads of vegetables being brought out of just a single field. But they would have been, probably went to larger processing facilities in big cities.
Well, I have a question. Is it a working farm today?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, but we don't, it's corn or beans. I
Okay.
mean, yeah. But we have pictures of the
Celery in there.
celery, the greenhouse,
Is this for us, for our
oh,
record?
no, I
This is
want
just
it, we
for you
just
to
brought
look
it
at.
for you
Okay.
to look at. Or you can
Alright.
take
Yeah, we
copies
can make
of it.
copies of it.
Yeah.
So this, great.
The Wild Rose Celery Farm.
If you wanted to talk to the granddaughters or,
So we were trying to figure out the viewpoint, like which direction they were facing when they took these photos, but look how big those stalks of celery were. You guys see that?
they can pass it around.
There it is.
It said,
the house still there?
Yes.
So do you know when Tracy stopped growing like the celery and vegetables on it, that it turned to corn?
He grew corn whenever we got it.
Okay.
what year did you guys buy the house?
77, but they farmed it, they rented it off of him for that. Or 75.
Says Tracy Johnson, which would have been their son, took over the farm, and the woman that wrote this, that was her great grandpa. She remembers him growing corn. But my cousin, who's 20 years older than me, remembers celery, onions, corn, and grain. I told her about the story of the horses getting stuck in the muck,
Oh,
and
yeah.
she said that she remembers Grandpa telling that same story. Tracy and Carolyn Johnson had the new farmhouse built between 1906 and 1910, so the old house was then used for the tenant farmers who worked on the celery fields, and after that the house was used for storage, which is basically what it is now, is storage space.
Yeah, the story, the workhorses, I don't know if you're familiar with muck, but they get, and the horses, they buried themselves out there in the field.
Well, thank you for that additional information. That's why I love giving these presentations, because I'm always learning more that I can
But
add to.
his granddaughter, they'd be the ones to talk to,
Okay.
You're in Michigan?
yeah. When you talk about the other guy moved to Michigan.
How many acres?
57.
57.
Yeah, that is a good photo.
How far away from the railroad track is this? Like a foot?
How about 40 feet?
Seriously?
Yeah.
No, it's about probably
Just
100
right
feet.
here.
It's this right.
Right over the
He was young in
railroad
that
track,
photo.
so where the two cross.
If you want, I don't care.
All right, any other questions we have? I know they want to share some of the images with you, so to add a little more to this, so I'm going to thank them for that addition. Okay, any other questions or comments that anybody has? Not? thank you for attending tonight.
So they had
A lot of research.